The blood-red sunset stretched across the horizon like a silent promise of vengeance, as the stagecoach rattled into the dusty outpost of Redemption Creek, Texas, carrying 3 brides-to-be whose dreams were about to shatter against the harsh reality of frontier life. It was April 1875, and the spring air carried the scent of wildflowers and gunpowder, an odd combination that seemed to define the untamed West itself. Pearl Evans clutched her small leather-bound Bible, her knuckles white with tension. At 22, she had traveled all the way from Boston to marry a man she knew only through letters. Beside her sat Prudence Edwards, barely 19, with fiery red hair and a stubborn chin that hinted at her Irish heritage. The third woman, Patience Elmwood, 24 and already widowed once before, stared out the window with practiced stoicism, her dark eyes revealing nothing of her thoughts. "Almost there, ladies," called the driver, his voice carrying over the steady clop of hooves and creak of wooden wheels. Redemption Creek, just as promised. The women exchanged nervous glances. They had met on this very coach 3 days ago, strangers united by a common purpose. Each had agreed to marry a man seeking a wife in the frontier territories. Their future husbands, 3 brothers who had struck gold and built a ranch, had paid for their passage west, promising stability and prosperity. As the stagecoach pulled into town, Pearl noticed something odd. The streets seemed unusually quiet for their arrival. They had been told there would be a welcome. Instead, a somber mood hung over the town like a shroud. The coach came to a stop outside the general store, and the driver helped them down one by one. An older woman with silver streaks in her hair approached them, her face grim. "You must be the brides," she said, her voice soft with sympathy. "I'm Martha Wilson, the shopkeeper's wife. I'm afraid I have terrible news." Pearl felt a chill run through her body despite the warm evening air. There was an attack on the Jacobson ranch 3 days ago. Bandits. All 3 brothers, Martha paused, struggling to find gentle words where none existed. "I'm sorry to tell you they are all dead." The world seemed to tilt beneath Pearl's feet. Prudence let out a small cry while Patience stood rigid, her face paling beneath her composure. "That's not possible," Prudence whispered. "Richard wrote to me just 2 weeks ago." Martha shook her head sadly. "They were buried yesterday. The sheriff is investigating," but she gestured helplessly. As the reality of their situation sank in, a tall figure approached from across the street. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to the saddle, dusty boots leaving prints in the dirt road. His face was partially shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat, but Pearl could see a strong jaw covered with a few days' worth of stubble. "Miss Wilson," the man said, tipping his hat. "These the ladies meant for the Jacobson boys." "Yes, Mr. Zaroff. Ladies, this is Blake Zaroff. He owns the ranch neighboring the Jacobson property." Blake studied them with clear blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, his face too weathered by sun and wind, his nose slightly crooked from an old break, but there was something arresting about him. Pearl guessed him to be in his early 30s. "You ladies have my condolences," he said, his voice deep and measured. "The Jacobsons were good men." "What are we supposed to do now?" Patience asked, the first words she'd spoken since receiving the news. Her voice was steady, practical, though Pearl could hear the strain beneath it. Martha looked uncomfortable. "Well, the stage won't be back through for another week, and even then, they can stay at my place," Blake interrupted. "I've got room enough, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Daniels, is there. It would be proper." Pearl bristled. "Sir, we don't know you." His expression didn't change. "No, madam, you don't. But you don't have many options right now. Town's small, no hotel to speak of. Most folks here live in single-room cabins. I'm offering shelter until you decide what's next." Prudence was quietly crying now, the shock finally breaking through her composure. Pearl put an arm around her while considering their predicament. They had spent nearly everything they had on the journey west. None of them had family to return to. That's why they'd agreed to marry strangers in the first place. "It's 10 miles to my ranch," Blake continued. We should leave now if we want to make it before full dark. Patience nodded first. Thank you, Mr. Zaroff. We accept your hospitality. Pearl wanted to object, but practicality won out. They were stranded penniless in a strange town where their intended husbands lay freshly buried. Within the hour, their trunks were loaded onto Blake's wagon. The three women sat in uncomfortable silence as he guided his team of horses out of town, the shadows lengthening across the trail ahead of them. The landscape opened before them, rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and mesquite, painted golden by the setting sun. Under different circumstances, Pearl might have found it beautiful. Now, it only emphasized how far they were from anything familiar. "I'm sorry about the Jacobsons," Blake said after they'd traveled a few miles. "They were good neighbors, hard-working men." "Did you know them well?" Patience asked. Blake shrugged. "Well enough. Helped them dig irrigation ditches last summer. They were excited about you ladies coming." He glanced back at them. They'd saved up a good bit from their claim, wanted to make a proper home. "Do you know what happened?" Pearl asked, finding her voice at last. Blake's shoulders tensed slightly. "Sheriff thinks it was the Dalton gang. They've been hitting isolated homesteads. Usually they just take valuables, horses. This time..." He didn't finish the thought. The remainder of the journey passed in heavy silence. As darkness fell, lights appeared in the distance. Blake's ranch. It was larger than Pearl had expected, a sprawling single-story house with a broad porch and several outbuildings. Lamplight glowed in the windows, welcoming and warm. As they approached, a woman emerged from the main house, stout and gray-haired, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Daniels," Blake called out, "we have guests." The housekeeper hurried down to the wagon, her expression shifting from curiosity to sympathy as Blake quickly explained the situation. "Oh, you poor dears," she said. Come inside, I'll fix you something to eat and get rooms ready." The interior of the house surprised Pearl. It was spacious and well-furnished, not the rough bachelor quarters she had imagined. The main room had a large stone fireplace, comfortable chairs, and bookshelves filled with volumes that spoke of an educated mind. "My father built this place," Blake explained, noticing her surprise. "He had grand ideas about ranching in Texas, brought my mother out here from Philadelphia. She insisted on certain comforts." Mrs. Daniels bustled about, heating stew and baking biscuits. The familiar domestic sounds and smells provided some comfort, though Pearl felt numb inside. She watched as Prudence sat staring into the fire, tears silently tracking down her freckled cheeks. After they had eaten, Mrs. Daniels showed them to their rooms in the east wing of the house. Pearl's room was simple but comfortable, with a real bed and a window overlooking the corral. Mr. Zaroff had these rooms built for his sisters when they visited from back east, Mrs. Daniels explained. "They don't come much anymore, not since their husbands settled them in Denver." When the housekeeper left, Pearl sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing her own tears to fall. She had risked everything on this journey west, and now she was stranded in a strange man's house, her future dissolved into uncertainty. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Patience, her practical nature reasserting itself. "We need to talk about what happens next," she said without preamble. "May I come in?" Pearl nodded, wiping away tears. Prudence joined them a moment later, her eyes red but her crying stopped. "We have very few options," Patience said, sitting beside Pearl on the bed. "None of us has enough money to return east." "I have $7.38, Prudence admitted. "It was supposed to be my pin money until Richard's next gold shipment came in," Pearl nodded. "About the same for me. Thomas promised he'd built us a fine house with real glass windows." The memory of his letters, so full of hope and plans, brought fresh tears to her eyes. Patience paced the small room. "We could try to find work in town. But places like this don't have much need for the skills we have." Pearl thought of her training as a schoolteacher useful, but most frontier towns already had someone teaching their children, usually a farmer's daughter with basic education. "Perhaps Mr. Zaroff would let us stay a while longer," Prudence suggested. just until we can earn enough for stage tickets. We can't impose, Pearl said firmly, and 3 unmarried women staying at a bachelor's ranch will raise eyebrows even with Mrs. Daniels here. Then what do we do? Prudence asked, desperation edging into her voice. None of them had an answer. Morning came too quickly. Pearl had slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of Thomas Jacobson, a man she'd never met but had imagined a future with. She dressed in her second-best dress, having worn her best for arrival yesterday. Its navy blue calico seemed appropriate for her circumstances. In the kitchen, Mrs. Daniels was already cooking breakfast. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air, and Pearl realized she was hungry despite everything. Blake Zaroff was seated at the table studying a ledger. He stood when the women entered, the gesture automatic and gentlemanly. "Ladies," he greeted them. "I trust you slept as well as could be expected." "Your hospitality is most appreciated, Mr. Zaroff," Patience replied. At 24, she naturally took the role of spokesperson for their small group. "Please call me Blake," he said, gesturing for them to sit. "Mrs. Daniels makes the best breakfast this side of the Mississippi." The housekeeper huffed with mock indignation. "The only breakfast you'd know is whatever you manage not to burn over a campfire, Mr. Zaroff." Their easy familiarity suggested a long-standing relationship. Pearl wondered about Blake's story, how a man who clearly came from some education ended up ranching alone in this remote part of Texas. As they ate, Blake outlined their options with unexpected thoughtfulness. "The stage comes through town every Tuesday," he explained. "That gives you 5 days to decide what you want to do. You're welcome to stay here until then or longer if needed." "That's very generous," Pearl said cautiously, "but we can't impose indefinitely." Blake looked at her directly, his blue eyes serious. "Miss Evans, my ranch is 20,000 acres. This house has stood mostly empty since my sisters married and left. Your presence here is hardly an imposition." "Still," Patience interjected, "we need to find a way to support ourselves." Blake nodded. "The town's growing. Sheriff mentioned they're looking for a schoolteacher, and Mrs. Wilson at the general store might need help." Pearl felt a flicker of hope. Teaching was what she knew. "I worked as a seamstress in Baltimore," Prudence offered quietly. It was the most she'd spoken since the devastating news. "And I kept books for my late husband's mercantile," Patience added. Blake seemed pleased. "There you have it. Useful skills, all of them." He stood up, placing his napkin beside his empty plate. "I need to check the south pasture today, but I'll take you into town tomorrow if you'd like to inquire about positions." After he left, Mrs. Daniels cleared the dishes. "He's a good man," she said matter-of-factly. "Lost his wife and child to fever 5 years back. Throws himself into the ranch work so he doesn't have to think about it." Pearl felt a twinge of sympathy. Loss seemed to be the common thread that connected all of them. Throughout the day, the women explored their temporary home. The ranch was impressive, a well-maintained operation with a dozen cowboys working the cattle, a smithy, stables, and fields where corn and vegetables grew in neat rows. Mrs. Daniels explained that Blake believed in self-sufficiency, growing what they needed rather than relying on infrequent supply wagons. In the afternoon, Pearl found herself wandering to the small ranch cemetery on a gentle hill behind the house. 4 markers stood in a row: Blake's parents and 2 smaller stones that must belong to his wife and child. She was so absorbed in thought that she didn't hear Blake approach. "Rebecca and James," he said softly, startling her. She was 26, he was 3. Pearl turned, embarrassed to be caught intruding on such a private place. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's all right," Blake said. His hat was in his hands and the sun highlighted strands of gray in his dark hair. "They've been gone a long time." Mrs. Daniels mentioned fever, he nodded. "Swept through the area in 70. Took half the town, including the doctor." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Pearl could sense the pain beneath his words. "Life out here is beautiful but harsh. The Jacobsons knew that. They still hoped for something more." "As did we," Pearl said quietly. Blake studied her face. What brought you west, Miss Evans? If you don't mind my asking. Pearl considered deflecting the question, but something in his direct gaze encouraged honesty. My father died last year. The school where I taught closed. Thomas's letters described a place where people were building something new. She looked out across the rolling landscape. I suppose I wanted to be part of that. And your family didn't object to you traveling so far to marry a stranger. A sad smile crossed her face. There is no family. Just an aunt who made it clear I had overstayed my welcome in her home. Blake nodded, understanding in his eyes. Well, for what it's worth, I believe you would have made a fine addition to this territory. Still can if you decide to stay. That evening, the three women gathered in Pearl's room again to discuss their options. I'm going to inquire about the teaching position, Pearl decided. If I can secure it, I could rent a small room in town. Mrs. Daniels mentioned the general store might need help with inventory and accounts, Patience said. My experience could be useful there. Prudence twisted her hands nervously. What about me? I can sew, but is that enough to live on out here? We stay together, Patience said firmly. Whatever happens, we came out here for a new start and we'll find one, just not the one we expected. The next morning, Blake drove them into town in his wagon. Redemption Creek looked different in daylight, a single main street with wooden buildings on either side, a church at one end and a saloon at the other, as if representing the two poles of frontier existence. Their first stop was the sheriff's office. Pearl had insisted on learning more about what happened to the Jacobson brothers. The sheriff, a weathered man named Holt, seemed reluctant to share details. It was a brutal business, ladies. You're probably better off not knowing the particulars. They were to be our husbands, Patience said firmly. We have a right to know, the sheriff sighed. The Dalton gang hit the ranch at night, 6 of them, according to tracks we found. The brothers put up a fight. We found 2 dead bandits there, but they were outnumbered. He paused. It was quick, at least, and we believe the gang has moved on toward the Arizona territory. Was anything taken? Blake asked. That's the strange part, Sheriff Holt replied. Their strongbox was broken open, but according to the ranch hand who survived, he was in the bunkhouse and played dead. There wasn't much gold there. The Jacobsons had converted most of their gold to bank drafts. They were planning to build a bigger house for when you ladies arrived. Pearl felt a lump in her throat. Men she'd never met had died preparing for her arrival. What happens to their property now? Patience asked, ever practical. They had a will drawn up last month, as it happens. Stipulates that if any of them died before marriage, their shares would be divided among the surviving brothers, with all 3 gone. The sheriff shrugged. The bank will likely foreclose and sell the property to cover their outstanding loans. They borrowed heavily to improve the ranch. It was another blow. Not that Pearl had expected to inherit anything, but it emphasized how completely their plans had collapsed. After leaving the sheriff's office, Blake introduced them to key people in town. The town council was indeed looking for a teacher, and Pearl's credentials impressed them enough that they offered her the position on the spot. The school term would begin in 3 weeks, with 15 children enrolled so far. Patience found an opportunity at the general store, where her bookkeeping skills were sorely needed. Prudence's situation was less certain until they met Mrs. Gardner, the town's only dressmaker, who was overwhelmed with work and delighted at the prospect of skilled help. By midday, all 3 women had secured positions. The question of housing remained, as accommodations in town were limited. You're welcome to stay at my ranch until you find suitable arrangements, Blake offered as they ate lunch at the small cafe. The school comes with a small teacher's cottage, but it needs repairs before it's habitable. Pearl studied him, trying to understand his motives. His kindness seemed genuine, but she had learned to be cautious of men's intentions. Why are you helping us, Mr. Zaroff? She asked directly. He seemed surprised by the question. Because you need help, he answered simply. And because the Jacobsons were my friends, they'd want me to look after their intended brides. There was nothing in his tone or expression to suggest ulterior motives, but Pearl remained wary. She had come west to marry, not to become dependent on a stranger's charity. As if reading her thoughts, Blake added, "I understand your concern, Miss Evans, but I assure you my offer comes with no expectations beyond providing shelter to 3 women in difficult circumstances." Later, as they prepared to return to the ranch, Pearl noticed Blake speaking intently with the sheriff. She couldn't hear their words, but the serious expressions on both men's faces suggested the conversation was important. On the ride back, Blake was quieter than usual, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. Pearl found herself studying his profile against the backdrop of the western sky. There was a steadiness to him that she found reassuring in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable. "Sheriff thinks the Dalton gang might not have been responsible for the attack on the Jacobson ranch," he finally said as they approached his property. "What makes him say that?" Patience asked sharply. "The Daltons usually avoid killing unless cornered. And they leave a signature, a playing card, the Jack of Spades. There was none found at the Jacobsons." "Then who?" Prudence's voice trembled, Blake's jaw tightened. "That's what concerns the sheriff. If it wasn't the Daltons, it might be someone local, someone who knew about the gold claim." The implication hung in the air. Someone in their small community might be responsible for the murders. The thought cast a pall over their arrival at the ranch. That night, Pearl found sleep elusive. She stood by her window, watching moonlight silver the landscape. The vast openness of Texas still felt alien after the crowded streets of Boston, but there was a wild beauty to it that stirred something in her soul. A movement caught her eye. Blake, walking slowly toward the small cemetery. In the moonlight, his tall figure seemed solitary and vulnerable. Pearl felt an unexpected urge to comfort him, to share the burden of grief they both carried. The next few days established a routine. Blake rode out early each morning to tend to ranch business, while the women helped Mrs. Daniels with household tasks and prepared for their new positions in town. Pearl found unexpected joy in creating lesson plans for her future students, while Patience organized the ranch's accounts as practice for her new role at the general store. Prudence remained the most subdued, still mourning the future she had imagined with Richard Jacobson. Pearl often found her sitting on the porch, staring toward the distant hills where the Jacobson ranch lay. "I feel foolish," Prudence confessed one afternoon as they shelled peas together. "I barely knew him through his letters, yet I grieve as if I'd lost a husband." "You're mourning the life you thought you'd have," Patience said gently. "There's no shame in that," Pearl nodded in agreement. "We all are, but perhaps we can build something different here." On Sunday, Blake drove them to the small church in town. The entire community seemed to turn out, dressed in their finest clothes. Pearl noticed how people deferred to Blake not out of fear, but respect. He introduced the women to everyone they hadn't met on their previous visit, smoothing their way into the community with subtle endorsements of their skills and character. After the service, they visited the Jacobson brothers' graves in the town cemetery. 3 fresh mounds of earth with simple wooden markers stood in a row. Pearl felt oddly disconnected as she stood before Thomas's grave, mourning a man whose face she knew only from a small, faded photograph he had sent her. "They were good men," Blake said quietly, standing beside her. "They deserved better than this." "As did we all," Pearl replied, surprised by the bitterness in her voice. Blake turned to face her, his expression serious. "Miss Evans, Pearl, I know this isn't the future you planned. But sometimes life's detours lead us to better destinations than the ones we mapped out." Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. There was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before, or perhaps she hadn't noticed it. "You sound like you speak from experience," she said. A faint smile crossed his face. "When Rebecca died, I thought my life was over, considered selling the ranch, heading back east, but this land gets in your blood." He gestured toward the horizon. "There's freedom here, room to become whatever you choose." Pearl found herself wanting to believe him, to embrace the possibility that this unexpected turn could lead somewhere worth going. The following Tuesday brought news that changed everything. Blake returned from town with a grim expression, gathering the women in the main room. "The sheriff found something," he said without preamble. "A gold pocket watch belonging to David Jacobson was pawned in El Paso. The man who tried to sell it matches the description of Frank Miller, who worked for the bank here until 3 months ago, the bank that held the Jacobsons' loans." Patience asked sharply. Blake nodded. "The sheriff believes Miller organized the raid on the ranch, hoping to find gold. When they didn't find what they expected, they killed the brothers to eliminate witnesses." "But why?" Prudence asked, her voice breaking. "Why kill them for nothing?" "Miller knew about their gold claim," Blake explained. "What he didn't know was that they'd already converted most of it to bank drafts for safekeeping. The sheriff thinks he assumed they kept their gold at the ranch." Pearl felt cold anger replace her grief. "Will they catch him?" "The sheriff has wired authorities in El Paso and San Antonio. Miller won't get far." Blake's voice had a hard edge she hadn't heard before. "The law will handle this." That night, Pearl couldn't sleep. The knowledge that the Jacobson brothers had been murdered for gold that wasn't even there filled her with restless anger. She went to the kitchen for a glass of water and found Blake sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in front of him. "You should be sleeping," he said, looking up at her entrance. "As should you," she countered, taking a seat across from him. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Pearl realized that somewhere in the past week, she had stopped thinking of Blake as a stranger. His steady presence had become a source of comfort in the chaos their lives had become. "I received a letter from the town council today," she said eventually. "The teacher's cottage will be ready by next Monday. They've hired men to make the repairs." Blake nodded slowly. "That's good news." "Yes," Pearl agreed, though she felt an unexpected reluctance at the thought of leaving the ranch. "Prudence and Patience will need to find accommodations as well." "Actually," Blake said, turning his cup in his hands, "I had a thought about that. The widow Johnson is looking to rent rooms. Her house is large and she'd welcome the company. It's right in town, convenient to both the store and Mrs. Gardner's shop." "That would be perfect for them," Pearl said, genuinely pleased by the solution. "And for you?" Blake asked, his eyes meeting hers. "Will the teacher's cottage suit you?" Something in his tone made Pearl pause. "It will serve my needs, yes." Blake seemed to wrestle with something before speaking again. "Pearl, I know this is sudden and perhaps inappropriate given the circumstances, but I've grown to admire you greatly in these past days." Pearl felt her heart quicken. "Mr. Zaroff, Blake," he corrected gently. "I'm not proposing anything improper, just suggesting that perhaps you might consider staying on here even after you begin teaching. The ranch is close enough to town and I could drive you each day. As your guest." Pearl asked, confused by the offer. A flush crept up his neck. "For now, but in time perhaps," he stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Forgive me, this is too soon. You're still grieving for Thomas Jacobson." Pearl shook her head slowly. "I'm grieving for a future that will never be." "But Thomas was a stranger to me, just as I was to him. We were willing to build a life together based on letters and hope." She studied Blake's face in the soft lamplight. "I've come to know you better in these past days than I ever knew Thomas." Hope flickered in Blake's eyes. "Then you'll consider my offer to stay?" "I'll consider it," Pearl said carefully. "But I need to establish myself as the teacher first, to find my own footing before anything else." Blake nodded, understanding in his expression. "That's fair and wise." As Pearl returned to her room, she found herself smiling. The future that had seemed so bleak a week ago now held new possibilities, unexpected, unplanned, but perhaps better than what she had imagined for herself. The next morning, Pearl shared Blake's news about the widow Johnson with Patience and Prudence. Both women were relieved to have a housing solution, though Pearl noticed Patience giving her a speculative look when she mentioned that she might delay moving to the teacher's cottage. "Blake Zaroff is an honorable man," Patience said when they were alone later, "and not unhandsome for a man who spends his days in the saddle." Pearl felt herself blushing. I don't know what you're implying. Patience smiled knowingly. I'm not blind, Pearl. I've seen how he looks at you. And how you look at him when you think no one notices. It's too soon, Pearl protested weakly. Life is short out here, Patience said, her expression sobering. My first husband and I wasted years circling each other before admitting our feelings. Then he was taken from me after only 2 years of marriage. She touched Pearl's arm gently. Don't squander happiness when it presents itself, whatever form it takes. The week passed quickly. On Saturday, Blake drove them into town to view their new accommodations. The widow Johnson's house was a pleasant 2-story building with comfortable rooms and a sunny parlor. Prudence and Patience would each have their own bedroom with a shared sitting room between. The teacher's cottage, by contrast, was a tiny 1-room structure behind the schoolhouse. It had been freshly whitewashed and repaired, with new glass in the windows and a small stove for heating and cooking. It was perfectly adequate, even charming in its way, but Pearl found herself comparing it to her comfortable room at Blake's ranch. It's lovely, she said, trying to sound enthusiastic. Blake studied her face. But not what you're used to. I didn't come west expecting luxury, Pearl replied, squaring her shoulders. No, Blake agreed. You came expecting partnership, a shared life. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning. Before Pearl could respond, the mayor approached them, eager to discuss final arrangements for the school term. That evening, back at the ranch, a telegram arrived for Blake. He read it with satisfaction. They've caught Miller, he announced at dinner. In El Paso, trying to book passage to Mexico, he confessed to organizing the raid on the Jacobson ranch. Will he hang? Prudence asked, her gentle face unusually hard. Most likely, Blake nodded. The sheriff says there's enough evidence to convict him and his accomplices. A weight seemed to lift from all of them. Justice wouldn't bring back the Jacobson brothers, but it provided some closure to the tragedy that had brought them together. After dinner, Blake asked Pearl to walk with him. The evening was mild, the setting sun painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. I've been thinking about what happens next, he said as they strolled toward the small rise that overlooked the property. For all of you. We'll manage, Pearl assured him. You've done more than enough already. Blake stopped, turning to face her. What if I don't want to stop helping? What if I want to do much more? Pearl's heart raced. What are you saying, Blake? I'm saying that I've spent 5 years alone, convinced that part of my life was over. Then 3 women arrived on my doorstep, and one of them, he took her hand carefully as if it might break. One of them made me remember what it feels like to care about tomorrow. Pearl looked down at their joined hands. Blake, I came here to marry a man I'd never met. I don't want to repeat that mistake jumping from one arrangement to another out of necessity. I'm not offering an arrangement, he said firmly. I'm offering a beginning. Stay here, teach your school, get to know me better. Let me court you properly. And Prudence and Patience? Pearl asked. What of them? They're welcome here as long as they wish to stay. This house has been too empty for too long. His blue eyes held her steadily. But it's you I'm asking, Pearl, you I want a future with, however long it takes to build it. Pearl thought of the path that had led her here, the loss of her teaching position, her father's death, the desperate letters to a stranger offering marriage. None of it had gone as planned, yet somehow it had brought her to this moment, this man. Yes, she said softly, then more firmly. Yes. I'll stay. We'll see where this leads. Blake's smile transformed his weathered face, making him look years younger. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, questioning kiss that held promise rather than demand. When they returned to the house, hand in hand, Patience and Prudence exchanged knowing looks. Mrs. Daniels, arranging flowers in the entryway, didn't bother hiding her approval. About time, the housekeeper muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The following months brought changes for all of them. Pearl began teaching at the small schoolhouse, finding unexpected joy in the eager minds of her frontier students. Each morning, Blake drove her to town. Each afternoon, he was waiting to bring her home. Patience thrived at the general store, her organizational skills and quick mind earning her the respect of everyone in town. By summer's end, she had purchased a share in the business and was courting the town's young doctor, a recent arrival from Chicago. Prudence's skill with a needle made her indispensable to Mrs. Gardner, who eventually offered her a partnership in the dressmaking shop. The shy young woman gradually emerged from her grief, and by Christmas was shyly accepting the attentions of the blacksmith's son. As for Pearl and Blake, their courtship progressed with deliberate care. They spent evenings reading together by the fire, rode across the vast ranch on Sundays after church, and slowly shared the stories of their lives before they met. Pearl learned about Blake's childhood in Philadelphia, his father's dream of empire in the West, his love and loss of Rebecca and their son. In turn, she told him of her strict upbringing, her passion for education, her brief engagement to a man who died in the war before they could marry. By spring, exactly 1 year after Pearl had arrived in Redemption Creek, Blake proposed properly on one knee in the wildflower meadow behind the ranch house, a ring that had belonged to his mother in his hand. Their wedding took place in June 1876, with Patience and Prudence as Pearl's attendants and the entire town in attendance. The schoolchildren presented their teacher with a handmade quilt, each square representing a lesson she had taught them. As Pearl exchanged vows with Blake under the old oak tree in the churchyard, she thought of the strange, twisted path that had led her to this moment. She had come west to marry a stranger and found love instead with the man who had offered shelter when she needed it most. The reception lasted well into the evening, with dancing and feasting and more goodwill than Pearl had ever experienced. As sunset painted the sky in familiar red and gold, Blake led his bride away from the celebration, back to the ranch that was now truly their home. Happy. He asked as they stood on the porch, looking out over the land that had brought them together. Pearl leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him against her. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. Inside, Patience and Prudence, who had insisted on staying at the widow Johnson's for the night to give the newlyweds privacy, had left a wedding gift on the table. It was a leather-bound album, and inside Pearl found pressed wildflowers, sketches of the ranch, and written accounts of their first days there, the beginning of their shared history. On the final page, Patience had written in her elegant hand, "We came seeking husbands and found a family instead." Some journeys end differently than expected, but that doesn't make the destination any less wonderful. As she closed the album, Pearl felt Blake's arms encircle her from behind. "They're right, you know," he murmured against her hair. "This isn't the ending any of us expected, but I wouldn't change it for all the gold in Texas." Pearl turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face, the face that had become as familiar and beloved to her as her own reflection. "Neither would I," she said softly. "Not a single step of the journey." And as Blake lowered his mouth to hers, Pearl knew that the adventure they had begun together was far greater than any she could have planned. In the harsh beauty of the Texas frontier, she had found not just shelter but home.